Welcome. I'm John Kingston, the editor-at-large at FreightWaves, and I'm here today with several representatives of the Trucking Alliance who are laying out a very ambitious agenda on the issue of safety and fraud and theft here in late 2025 and into 2026. It's the kind of thing that really touches on so many issues that are so prevalent in the trucking industry today, ones that have really come to the forefront, I think, this year. It's 2025 as we're coming to an end of the year and wondering if this is going to get some of these situations are going to get worse or better in 2026. The Trucking Alliance is leading this charge to try to make it better, and we are happy to have them with us today at FreightWaves to discuss if they are, as I said, their very ambitious agenda. I'm going to kick things off by turning things over to Steve Williams. Steve is the co-founder and president of the Trucking Alliance, and he's also the chairman and CEO of Maverick USA. Steve, welcome to FreightWaves. Why don't you talk about the Trucking Alliance and what it does, its history,
Sure.
how it got to this point, and kind of sum up what you're planning on doing with this really forward-looking agenda and list of priorities going into the new year.
Thank you, John. It's actually pretty exciting time because we have been working on a lot of very principal foundational issues for 12, 13 years. And we, in fact, have been successful in getting a lot of those accomplished, whether it be ELDs or the National Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. We got hair test recognized as a valid test, the requirement of electronic braking. Our agenda is obviously all about safety and the safety of our drivers and those that we share the road with. And yet we realize that all of these decisions and change that we make have a tremendous impact on those people that are within the industry. And the impact that we're trying to make is a positive one. And it takes a strategic vision, one of which I don't think the industry has had, or it's subscribed to the wrong one. For context, over my lifetime, the U.S. population has doubled. So the solutions that we had in the 50s are not the same solutions that we have in the mid 20s. So I think our vision is a strategic vision. It's based upon real hard evidence. It's based upon a vision that will, in fact, improve highway safety dramatically. I think we've all kind of lost context in our competitive environment here in the US that we collectively are getting behind the rest of the world. And I think that some of that starts at grassroots and in regulatory issues, but a lot of it is very foundational.
Okay. Before we go any further, let's talk about who else is joining us here from the Trucking Alliance with FreightWaves today. We have Greer Woodruff. He's the Executive Vice President for Safety, Sustainability, and Maintenance at JB Hunt. We have Brett Sant. He's a Senior Vice President at Knight Transportation. And we also have Lane Kidd, who is the Managing Director of the Trucking Alliance. So welcome to all of you. So
Thank you.
who wants to go first? Before we get into some of the specifics, let's talk about why now. I mean, you have a multi-point agenda, numerous goals. Why now? These issues aren't really new, though some of them I think are certainly kind of blown up this past year. What caused you to sort of sit down and say, okay, let's put together all of our various priorities and our goals and our desires into one prevailing document and put this out to the world?
Yeah, let me take that for you, John. The Trucking Alliance has been around for, well over a decade now. As Steve mentioned, we've had a lot of success with our priorities in the past. And it was just time for us to sit down and kind of reevaluate where we thought the opportunities were to improve highway safety and security. And some of the issues that are on our priority list today have been on the list for some time. Some of them are new because they're kind of emerging issues that have more recently surfaced that we thought we needed to research and evaluate and carefully consider and come up with some strategies of how we thought we could address those maybe more recently emerging issues. So that's how we arrived at, our priority list. And we're committed to pursue those and try to have a positive impact on the industry and on the highways that we share with other motorists.
So in the list of your points in an executive summary that you published, the first 3 points all start with the same word, under. Under-enforced, underinsured, and undercapitalized. Let's start with underinsured. I have to say that I was kind of stunned at some of the numbers in there about the number of trucks on the road that you say have no safety rating. The question is, I mean, how big are they? How big is that number? And how are they all out there? How can you manage to stay out there without a safety rating? And what do you and let's talk about what you would like to see done about it.
I'll jump in on that one. And it is a surprising statistic when you look at the numbers that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration has released. You quickly see that upwards of 90% of all of the trucking companies operating on the nation's highways do not have a federal safety rating. That's bad enough, but layer in over that the fact that those unrated carriers are engaged in 84% of all of the serious large truck crashes that involve fatalities and injuries. So in other words, if you do the math on this, a truck operated by an unrated carrier today is 9 times more likely to be in a crash than a truck operated by a rated carrier. That's a significant safety problem that until recently, I'm not sure that the industry has really been that focused on it. And it's one of our top safety priorities is that we ask and we urge DOT to focus on making sure that those unrated carriers have enough inspections and roadside inspections until they can have a rating. Otherwise, you have shippers, you have logistics companies that are hiring trucking companies to deliver their freight. They look on the website, they see this carrier doesn't have a rating. Do they operate safely or not?
When you say rating, you're talking about a CSA score or some other kind of rating?
We're talking about the carrier safety rating in the current regime. Carriers in theory are supposed to be rated either satisfactory, conditional, or unsatisfactory. The proliferation of new carriers, particularly over the last 4 or 5 years, and even longer, though, to be honest, has resulted in the FMCSA and their partners at the state level just not being able to keep up with the new entrant audits to rate these new carriers as they join. So there are quite a few carriers who may have anywhere between a few months and several years of operating history who have never been audited or rated, and who, by the way, because of their size, just have not had sufficient amounts of roadside enforcement data collected on them, which do serve as the basis for many of the audit points in a full compliance review. So the lack of roadside enforcement for those carriers, the lack of a full compliance review or audit of those carriers has meant, by and large, that many just operate without adequate enforcement. And I think the issue that you originally asked about, the insurance issue, is related. If you think back to when Congress created the Motor Carrier Safety Act in 1980 and deregulated the industry, the idea was that they would establish minimum financial responsibility requirements for all motor carriers. And in theory, then the insurance industry would help regulate those carriers. Because that financial minimum has remained the same as it was in 1980, which is as low as $750,000, many of those carriers, particularly the ones we'll call non-fleet operators, so these are fewer than 5 or 10 power units, they're really not underwritten the way you would maybe expect. In fact, if you look at one of the large insurance underwriters who captures about 15 to 20% of the market, their average fleet size is less than 2 power units. And there really is no, beyond rating and surcharging those carriers, there really isn't an in-depth underwriting that takes place to appraise the risk of that carrier. A lot of it's data driven, and the data is lacking, again, because of the lack of roadside enforcement. So What you have is a situation where hundreds of thousands of operators operating well more than 1 million power units really are not scrutinized either by the FMCSA and their state partners or by the insurance industry when they are underwritten. And that's a real problem.
Let's go back to the first point about the under enforced. Obviously, the big goal is you want more enforcement. What are some of the things you're recommending to make that happen?
Yeah, John, let me jump in on that one if I could. And just for a little bit of context, we are talking about two different things, which is where you were going a moment ago. We have safety ratings, which are, satisfactory, conditional, and unsatisfactory. That's done typically from an on-site compliance review. And the likelihood of an enforcement person going to do a compliance review at a driver's home or a small office with, a small number of trucks is really not likely to occur within the enforcement scheme. So then you have roadside inspections as another means of enforcement. And we see that many of the carriers that are out there do not have sufficient data to meet the data quality standards to have a CSA basic score. And so that becomes the problem is I don't have a safety rating and I don't have a CSA basic score and all of the basics because I haven't been inspected at roadside enough to generate the score. What we would like to see happen is we are in favor of what's called a level 8 inspection, where the truck can communicate information, including hours of service and other information as they approach a weigh station. We can provide that data electronically, and the inspection station can either ask us to pull in or ask our driver to bypass that station. We are piloting that with many of our alliance carriers with FMCSA, and we're seeing good results with that. And so we would like to see that advance. We would like to see level 8 inspections established, and we would like to see a clean inspection credit given for carriers that are bypassed that have exchanged this information and that information is showing compliance. That could free up then the resources at the inspection stations to pull in drivers who have insufficient data or who do not have a CSA basic score using the ISS or inspection selection system by recommending that those drivers be pulled in. And we should pull them in until they have sufficient data in which to generate a basic score. So those are a couple of changes we could see with enforcement that would help ensure that more of the carriers are, given a good look.
And how complicated and expensive is the technology to make that happen? You say you've been working a trial with FMCSA and you like the results. Let's say everybody says, okay, the technology works. It's great. How much are we talking about, like per truck and versus investment that has to be made on the FMCSA side, or it's just on the safety side?
Yeah, it's really not that expensive, and I don't want to get into specific dollars, but you're talking about pre-pass and drive-wise, which many trucks and drivers have those technologies on them today. I'm sure there could be new entrants into that, but those are the systems used today to communicate either with a transponder or with just a geo-fenced location and communication protocols to the roadside inspector. So those exist today. They're on many, many trucks. They're available to small truckers or independent operators that might want to use those on a smartphone or an ELD type device. So they are available to anybody in the industry that wants to subscribe to that and then take advantage of the opportunity to participate in the level 8 inspections.
Right. So this is not, FMCSA is not set up to do this with everybody now. You're doing a pilot program, but presumably you'd like to see it get to the point where FMCSA announces you can do this.
We would like that, and we would like to have criteria established to where we could get some credit when our stuff's in order and we're given the clearance to bypass. Because now we just bypass, we don't get the clean credit, which is part of the CSA score. We need those clean inspections in the denominator for us to have a accurately calculated score.
Okay, let's go on to the second point we started to touch on about underinsured You talked about the minimum requirement being $750,000, and it's been that way for like 45 years. I know that New Jersey raised it to 1.5 million about a year ago with no apparent crisis in the amount of available supply, amount of capacity. What are the chances of this happening? This is a Congress that hasn't raised a federal gasoline tax since the early 90s. It doesn't seem to like to want to raise anything. Is this possible? Do you see this happening?
Well, we certainly think it's possible, but you're right. It's not something Congress has been wanting to really get after. But we do think, and Lane, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we do think that the FMCSA has the existing authority without Congress's action to increase those minimum requirements. And we are actively working to provide the data to the FMCSA to help them assess that issue and determine how they might increase those minimums and to what extent. But if you look at the industry structurally, there are a couple of reasons why this is important. Number one, as I pointed out earlier, we think that it will help encourage insurance companies to properly underwrite these carriers. When you have a $1 million limit, the level of underwriting kind of reflects that exposure on a per carrier basis. So that needs to be increased just to encourage more extensive and meaningful underwriting of these carriers. The other factor, though, that we have to understand is these limits create an insurance marketplace that is really untenable for everybody. The fact of the matter is, if you look at any serious injury today, or something that would be paraplegia or a serious traumatic brain injury, the minimum limit today is just not enough to provide for the medical care, let alone any of the other damages that are involved for someone who's injured in such an accident. And so you have situations where there's litigation, juries are awarding significant damages, and then those damages really aren't compensated because the assets aren't there and the insurance isn't there to adequately cover those damages. However, the insurance companies, the cost of those claims, the cost of defending those claims, settling those claims is increased, and those costs are not properly allocated among the risk pool. If we properly established limits that would ensure that injury victims are properly compensated, and those costs were allocated properly across the risk pool, you'd have a much healthier environment for motor carriers to buy insurance, be a much more stable environment for motor carriers to buy insurance, and you would ensure that victims are properly compensated. Right now, we're really not accomplishing either goal.
All right, let's talk about your third point, undercapitalized. And in your summary of your views and where you've identified the issue, you say low financial barriers to entry effectively create trucking operations that are insolvent and unsafe on their first day of operation. As we know, barriers to entry in trucking have always been very low. You study industries about who has high barriers to entry, and like pharmaceuticals are always the one with one of the highest barriers to entry. Transportation has always been pretty low. It's even not that big to start an airline, and that sounds crazy. So you can imagine what it's like to try to start a trucking company. How would you like to see those barriers? It's not so much that you want to see the barriers to entry rise, but you want to see that pathway to entry is sufficiently capitalized. How do you make that happen?
Well, if you look at when Congress first deregulated the industry back in 1980, and you must assume that Congress had some wisdom when they did that, because it was generally supported by the industry. On the other hand, Congress wanted to ensure that the trucking companies that did enter the industry would do so safely and that would have the capital to properly maintain and operate their equipment. So they arrived at $750,000 in 1980, which was a considerable amount of money in 1980. In fact, that would equate with inflation to about $2.9 million today. Well, obviously, a trucking company is not required to have that kind of financial worth to start a trucking company today. You can start one for about $20,000 if you want to borrow enough. And that fact of a trucking company being insolvent on the first day of operation was, in fact, the conclusion of a study that the American Transportation Institute did last year. That we have a situation where anyone with the ability to put a sign on the side of a truck can be in the trucking business the following day. In any industry that operates in the public sector, where it is putting the public at risk, should be adequately financed, should be adequately insured, and should be, adequately trained in maintaining their equipment. So to do that, the first step would be for the FMCSA to propose an increase in the minimum insurance required to start one. And today that would be about 2.9, some would say 3, and if you adjust it for medical inflation, it would be about 3.6 million. That in itself would probably preclude many people who should not be in the trucking industry to begin with from even starting. And we could rid ourselves of many of the safety issues.
So the underinsurance and the undercapitalized issues are pretty linked here, and requiring more insurance really is the way to get the way to get better capitalized companies into the business.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
All right. Now your fourth point is it's throwing out a big giant net, systemic fraud. Fraud is all the talk in the industry. I have to say, as a guy from the North, my generation who's watched Goodfellas 57,000 times, knowing that part of the way they made money, the crooks made money back then, were to steal trucks. The fact that it seems to have just exploded this year for a crime that's been around for a long time, not just this year, but in recent years, is really, really notable. So what are some of your, there are so many fraud issues out there. What do you think are the biggest ones? And what do you think are the solutions that government can pursue?
Yeah, let me mention a couple at least, and someone else may want to chime in. But, one of the things that we saw occur during COVID was you saw this proliferation prior to COVID of electronic or digital freight matching and digital load boards. Those arose, and you wanted to have low friction. You wanted to make it easy for loads to be posted and easy for carriers to be onboarded and come and select those loads. And that made them susceptible to cargo theft. And that combined with FMCSA's carrier credentialing process, which is undergoing some modernization now, which is welcome. But it has been easy for foreign actors to come onto load boards, take one of those loads, post it on another load board, hire a legitimate carrier and driver to pick that load up, redirect that load in transit to another delivery location. That's a warehouse that's been leased by the thieves. The load's unloaded and another legitimate carrier comes and picks it up at that warehouse and moves it to another location. And so we've seen that occur. There's been social engineering to get drivers to give their password to FMCSA's safer site. They go in and change the email address and the phone number. And when a broker calls to verify that they've accepted the load, you're calling the thief. They can also social engineer to get their passwords to get into the load boards offered by brokers. And so there's kind of this web of different avenues that can be exploited with the digital freight matching boards and with FMCSA's credentialing for carriers that has become problematic. That's led to a lot of cargo theft. It's led to a lot of carriers hauling loads for which they do not get paid for because they thought they were pulling a load for a legitimate broker and they were not. So some of the things that we feel like would be helpful with that is we do applaud the work of FMCSA to tighten up and modernize their credentialing system. That's in place for new entrants now, and that will be applied to the full carrier population in 2026. And we think that's going to go a long way in really authenticating the representative of the company, and then ensuring that before anybody can get access to their FMCSA data and site and make any changes, that it has to be an authorized and verified person.
So you so you think there's a government solution that's ready to go, and you want to see how this plays out?
That's correct. We believe there's some opportunities there that will cut down on this scam that's going on, and so we're very hopeful from what we have seen so far that we're going to have a good solution there.
Does your organization though also reach out to the load boards to try to have them amend their ways where you think it might be helpful?
We do. We communicate, where we see the weaknesses in the system. We thoroughly investigate these with our security departments, and we have tons of intelligence that we can discover when we're investigating these types of thefts. Those provide insights into how do we tighten up our own systems, how do we cover up or make up for some of those areas that have been exploited. And we communicate those with the FBI and other law enforcement, the load boards and others. And so there's been an effort, really. We saw a proliferation of these thefts in 2023. We've seen a decline in those and really a return more to straight cargo thefts, which is just stealing a load that's at rest somewhere. We've seen a shift back to that more recently. But there's still some work that we can do to tighten this up and reduce the fraud that's taking place.
Okay, let's go on to the next. Let's go on to the next point. Illegal freight. I mean, this is all. I mean, they're all connected to some degree, but we're under your heading of illegal freight. You're really talking about foreign trucking companies. You're talking about the violation of the rule that if, let's say, a trucker comes in from Canada to somewhere in the U.S., they're supposed to do one of two things: go back empty to Canada or pick up some more freight that goes to Canada. They can't come down to Chicago and then drop something off in Minneapolis. Ditto for Mexico. This is, I know, I will tell you that I don't really had heard that about being a big problem until the last couple of years. And now I hear about it all the time. Has this exploded the last few years? And again, what are the regulatory steps, enforcement steps that will be taken to deal with this issue?
Yeah, back to the previous point, so many of these issues are interrelated, and it's about, for example, if you think about the fraud issues, so many of the fraud issues are related to the licensing issues. So many of the fraud issues are related to the insurance issues, and so many of the fraud issues then are related to the lack of roadside enforcement. If for example, we had the ability through these level 8 inspections to prioritize carriers with no data, you'd be pulling more of these carriers in for inspections, leveraging the technology that's available today, and certainly going forward as we move forward in the future, the technology that maybe we aren't leveraging that we could leverage would make it that much harder for fraudulent carriers to operate. And so I think it's important to note how interrelated these issues are. But speaking specifically about the cabotage issue, we've long suspected that it's a bigger problem maybe than we thought. But now that there are technologies out there, and I'll mention one that has really shed more light on this problem than maybe we understood before, and that is GenLogs. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that technology, but I know one thing that GenLogs has done is they've analyzed this issue. For example, and I'm not sure exactly what period of time they were looking at, but I know GenLogs identified at least 970 Mexican-based or Mexican-domiciled carriers with OP2 authority who are operating far north of the border zones in as many as 20 states and had been captured tens of thousands of times moving within these states outside of the border zone. and there's just simply no reason for those carriers to be there, and you'd have to conclude that they are operating illegally. So those issues affect safety. They affect the security of our drivers and the workforce in the United States, and we feel like with the technology that exists today, enforcement could be much more effective at regulating that kind of abuse.
Yeah, and let me just add a couple of things. I think that the efforts around the English language proficiency probably brought this to light quicker than it might otherwise have come to light, because through that enforcement, I think it revealed itself to us in a much larger way. And I think that, usually this cabotage violation has been more viewed as an economic issue and more of a customs and border protection problem to resolve. I think that we need to see some coordination between Customs and Border Protection and FMCSA to help with this. There should be some out-of-service criteria established for violation of cabotage at a roadside inspection. Not only can you identify if they can meet the English language proficiency, but you would typically ask for the bill of lading, and you would be able to see the origin and destination and determine from that person's license and authority to operate in the United States whether they were in violation or not. So I think there could be a coordinated effort to strengthen enforcement with that. And then, as Brett said, there's emerging technologies being used in businesses today that could be applied to very specific use cases for government to use for enforcement purposes. So we would encourage them to look at the technologies that we use and find their own specific use cases that they could apply that technology to.
Do you think the English language crackdown is by itself going to take care of, I don't say a lot of these problems, but going to have a significant issue on just sort of self-correcting some of these problems?
I think there's been some of that. I mean, I think that, some of the carriers, let's say specific from Mexico, and it's going to happen with Canadian carriers as well. But I think that the increased enforcement has caused some of those Mexican carriers to return back to Mexico. We've seen an increase in available capacity in Mexico over the last couple of months that are probably because of more of the Mexican carriers returning back to their country and not spending as much time in the United States. But I'm sure there's continuing violations that we need to address. But I do think it has corrected itself to some extent.
Well, let's skip the next point, which is cargo theft, which is really all part of a lot of what we've been talking about. And your next point on your sort of list of desires and list of actions is licensing fraud. Now, some of that is very much in the news right now. So what would you like to see? What do you think has happened so far that you think is going to have a significant impact? And what would you like to see happen going forward?
Well, again, I do think these things are all interrelated. So if you look at the explosion in cargo theft over the last 3 or 4 years, you can also see the explosion in CDLs issued, and the number of CDLs issued to people from outside of the United States on these non-domiciled licenses, and I think those things are correlated. So we feel like if we just enforce the laws and the regulations that are on the books effectively, and start to leverage new technologies to help do that more effectively. And we've talked about the level 8 inspections. We've talked about how to maybe use that technology to enforce the cabotage rules. What the administration is doing to enforce the CDL licensing standards will all help get at the fraud, as well as some of the things that Greer mentioned related to the social engineering types of fraud. But certainly the cargo theft, there has to be a correlation there between all of these licensing issues and the proliferation of licensees, CDLs, and operating authorities have facilitated fraud and theft, and so taking kind of a whole approach here to better regulating the operating authorities, raising the bar, raising the standards, enforcing the licensing requirements, and enforcing the cabotage rules will all have a positive effect on reducing cargo theft and fraud.
Those 7 points are the kind of main subheads in your agenda. Do you feel though, even beyond the work that you're doing, do you feel like there's been almost a shift, a tipping point in terms of regulation of trucking that possibly had gotten a little bit laissez-faire for a long time? A lot of the things that you're talking about that you'd like to see done are not new rules. You're talking about enforcement of existing rules. Do you think that maybe there has been a shift toward something that's not just going to burn out after a couple of months, that there's a whole different approach that might not necessarily be just part of the Trump administration, that maybe the next administration, Republican or Democrat, continues it, that we're kind of in a new era? Do you get that sense? Lane, you're down there in Washington.
I do get that sense. And, like many transformational changes, sometimes it just takes one episode or one incident for huge changes to occur. And I think that we've seen that in the last several months with a handful of very tragic and horrible large truck accidents that should not have happened. And the general public became aware of these crashes because there were videos in place to record them. And then you got the attention of Secretary Duffy. And, Sean Duffy and I believe the leadership at FMCSA are probably more attuned to the trucking industry than any previous appointees that I've seen in the last 20 years. And go on social media, and now you're starting to see all of these videos of tractor trailers trying to do U-turns in the middle of the desert, and they're getting stuck in the sand. And the general public is aware, and they're aware that maybe now we have an issue with an industry that a lot of us didn't pay attention to, but because of these recent accidents, they're very focused on it. And I think that will continue, and it's a good thing because we need to make some changes to rid the industry of a very fractious underbelly that probably should not be engaged in the industry at all.
Yeah, Lane, let me chime on that, John, a minute, because I did want to stress that, the overwhelming majority of drivers in our industry are professional, safe drivers, and we need them. They fuel our economy. We are very dependent on them. And these other drivers that use drugs and drink behind the wheel and aren't properly trained and don't have a CDL and do unsafe acts out there, damage the reputation of the overwhelming majority of safe professional drivers. And that's part of why we have this agenda, as we want to protect the reputations of the really good companies out there and the really great drivers that are out there. And to do that, we've got to address the problems of the carriers and the drivers on the fringe that are damaging the reputation of the entire industry.
I think one of the more interesting crackdowns that I didn't see coming, because it's really been a kind of a non-issue for years, are this withdrawal of ELDs by FMCSA. I didn't think I fully grasped how important the industry thought that these, I hate to say that they're all bad actors, but that some of these not particularly top-notch ELDs were actually allowing people to violate hours of service rules, and they were certainly contributing to some of the negative conditions for drivers in the market, and maybe hitting that market on rates. Has that been a really welcome impetus? Every so often we get a press release that an ELD was withdrawn, and then a few weeks later another ELD was withdrawn, and now you're seeing just in bunches week after week. It's really been fascinating to watch. Why don't you speak about that and how much of a safety or a safety and really capacity impact you think that might have?
Well, it's certainly one of compliance and a compliance issue. If you look at the ELDs that are on the market, we went along after the Congress had mandated ELDs in 2012, and by 2016, they still weren't operational. And FMCSA finally decided, well, instead of trying to, certify every single manufacturer. Let's just let them self-certify and promise us on the honor system that they work. And what we found in the first year, compliance ratios were great. The violations were down. But then over about a 3 or 4 year period, we saw instances where, according to one source, 88,000 violations occurred because the ELD could not transmit its data to the officer at the roadside standing by the truck. And so that became a violation. Well, the only way we can correct that, as I understand it, with about 300 ELDs that have been revoked, we still have about 1,100 on the market, is for FMCSA to do a very bold thing, and that is to require those ELDs to recertify and to contract with an independent third-party certification lab and require the ELDs to go back through the channel, as they never have had to do, to certify that their ELD will work. Because many drivers, they've been picking up an ELD on the rack at a truck stop, and they're thinking that it's going to work, and it doesn't. And they're the driver who winds up with the violation unintentionally, because the driver thought that the ELD would work and it doesn't. So we're going to really push nicely at FMCSA to revisit the ELD issue and to require these ELD companies to go back through an independent certification process.
How high of a level of success do you think you'll achieve? As I said, there already seems to be a willingness on the part of FMCSA to toss out some ELDs that aren't working. Does that give you hope that you can maybe more codify this?
Yes. And well, if not codified, at least I believe that FMCSA is, for the first time in recent memory, willing to contract with third-party providers. For many years, FMCSA thought that they had to go through Volpe, or they had to do it internally. They had to create their own mechanism. And I think there's a willingness now for FMCSA to say, no, there's better stuff in the private sector than we can do. And so if they will agree to contract with third-party independent labs, then that should be a much smoother process. At least at this point, they seem willing to talk about it.
And today they're reacting, and by finding a better and more objective certification, we could become proactive and prevent a lot of these issues.
Yeah, John, this is a good example of a lot of the regs and that we've advanced over the years. We were really happy that we made the progress that we've had, but we've learned that they don't always work the way that we had hoped that they would or understood that they would. And this is just another good example of that. And it's just going to take us a while to close all the loopholes, if you will, and then we'll be where we need to be. But I think overarching all of this is one of the things that we've always embraced within the Alliance, is that trucking and what we do is a privilege. And with privileges come additional responsibilities. This is not an entitlement. So the industry needs to embrace that vision of doing the right thing. And it not only is it the right thing, and I touched on this earlier, this is really strategic. It's strategic for our individual companies within the Alliance. It's strategic for the industry. It's strategic for our nation. And I think that people need to understand that we're at a tipping point, and it's either going to get a lot worse from a safety standpoint. I don't think it will, because I think we're going to prevail on these issues, or we have an opportunity to do something about it. And we kind of look at ourselves as the change agent, if you will, that wanted to advocate for those kinds of radical changes, because it's the right thing to do long-term regardless.
Let's talk about an issue where you've been very much the leader for a long time, and that's hair testing for drugs. Where does that stand now? It's never really become a regulation. You always seem to kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Do you feel like we're at the point where this might start to become law? I know a lot of companies are doing it. Your proposal really also asks for kind of a zero tolerance for marijuana, which would have been easy 15 years ago when it was illegal everywhere. But now where recreational marijuana use is legal in a lot of places, including the state that I'm sitting in, New York. Does that going to make it tougher to really try to ban marijuana, where a truck driver can have a beer but can't have some marijuana?
Well, marijuana for recreational use is much different than marijuana in a professional job, where you're putting the public at risk. And there are so many studies about the use of marijuana and what effect they have on driving and a driver's capacity to be alert and conscious. Same thing, marijuana may not be as acute a drug as fentanyl, but neither one need to be in a driver's system if he's going to operate a tractor trailer rig on the highway. So I don't think it'll be a heavy lift to keep marijuana as a prohibited drug in the industry. As it relates to hair testing, I shared with an FMCSA official last week two sentences, and I said, how would this stand with the general public? The Department of Transportation will disqualify a truck driver if that driver fails a urine exam for drug use. The Department of Transportation will not disqualify a truck driver if he fails a hair test for drug use. Keeping in mind that a hair test is 14 times more effective at identifying drug use than a urine test. There's no way that logically this industry can allow the administration to just continue to drag its feet. We saw the Biden administration stop on a dime after the first Trump administration left office. The hair test regulation was moving through the Department of Health and Human Services, and for whatever reason, the Biden administration stopped, and it did not move forward through 4 years. Now we're back to a second Trump administration, and the agencies are talking about trying to make something happen. I don't think it'll happen through a rulemaking with hair test guidelines being approved for any time soon. I think that we have to find another way, and there are some ways that we're looking at and under consideration that would give the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration the ability to go ahead and recognize hair testing today. And that would allow the trucking companies that are hair testing to submit those results to the clearinghouse, and that'll be a strategy that we'll announce after the first of the year.
Has the clearinghouse been as impactful as you thought it would be in terms of limiting capacity? It's kind of hard to think that way because I forget what year the clearinghouse went into effect, like 2022, was it? I'm not really sure. I don't recall now. And here we are with everybody saying, one of the reasons that this industry cannot find itself in a higher rate environment, though that seems to be changing in just the past few weeks, is because there's so much capacity. It didn't seem to be the death of capacity that a lot of people thought it was. You were one of the leaders in the clearinghouse.
Yeah.
What kind of review do you give it this many years later?
Let me mention that, and first let me just be clear: the intentions with the clearinghouse was not to eliminate capacity.
Understood, but that was always going to be a kind of a side impact. I know the
Right,
goal.
and keep in mind those drivers that are testing positive and showing up in the clearinghouse can go through a process in which they can return to duty. So we would welcome and encourage all of them to go through that process and return back to driving and do it, abstaining from drug and alcohol use. But I would say the clearinghouse has been hugely successful with the urine tests and the other things that we're able to report in there, that it has identified drug use and alcohol use, and it has taken those drivers out of service until such time as they go through the substance abuse and professional requirements to return to a safety sensitive job. Where it is deficient is what Lane mentioned, is that many of us do hair testing. We have positive results from drivers that we do not allow to drive and operate for us, but we don't have a mechanism in which we can make other motor carriers aware of those positive results from those drivers. As a result, they likely go to work for someone else and continue their lifestyle of drug use, putting those companies at risk of an accident that they may be liable for, and putting the general public at risk that they're still out there operating under the influence. So that's why we feel like we need a mechanism to get those positive results into the clearinghouse so that other employers can at least be aware of what they're dealing with.
And if you look at our agenda items too, a pretty bold agenda item, I think, in that particular section is that if you look at the industry, yes, a truck driver who operates a large tractor trailer rig in this country is required to pass a hair test. But there are more truck drivers who are operating panel trucks, delivery trucks, straight trucks. They're for hire. They're commercial truck drivers. They're posing the same risk to the public as the driver of a heavy tractor trailer rig, and they don't have to be drug tested. And so what we're finding is, and it's a little bit anecdotal, is that many of the truck drivers who fail their hair or urine tests are simply dropping down in classification to operate panel trucks and delivery trucks because they don't have to pass a drug test. So one of our agenda items is that let's be true to what the purpose of a safety sensitive occupation is at the Department of Transportation. And let's require every for-hire commercial truck driver, regardless of the type of truck he operates, to pass a drug test. Seems pretty simple. And whether that would be done legislatively or through regulation, I'm not sure.
And just back one more point back to the clearinghouse and whether it's been impactful or effective. If you think about how drivers are hired by carriers, what the clearinghouse has done is it's created a tremendous amount of transparency and visibility into the level of compliance at the driver level. Okay, so now we can see what's happening with drivers because those tests all go in through one centralized system. And so now that visibility really helps in and of itself. But what it also does is it creates that much more accountability for the motor carriers who are hiring drivers to ensure that they're following the rules faithfully and ensuring that those drivers, not only have they been tested, but if they've been tested in the preceding 3 years, those motor carriers have access to that history and can ensure that they're complying with the rules. So I think in and of itself, that has been a tremendous success.
Let's wrap things up here with the members of the Trucking Alliance, or some of the leaders of the Trucking Alliance, and ask you, if we're sitting down here in December of 2026, how many of these things do you think could get done, and how many of these goals are will still be aspirational as opposed to realistic? I feel that you've come a long way, not just you, but the industry has come a long way in the last several months on regulatory actions that maybe nobody ever really thought might have been taken. What do you think is going to get taken in 2026 where you can kind of declare success 12 months from now?
I would jump in and then let the others mention too. I think we'll have a more robust credentialing process for all of our training schools in the country. I think there's the position taken by Secretary Duffy to basically revoke the privileges of about 3,000 schools because it looked like they weren't performing as they should have been. We'll probably see a better curriculum and a more robust training system at the schools. And I'll pass it off to the other three for their prediction.
Yeah, I would add, I would just say, I think that there are some very aspirational priorities here, and they're not going to be solved quickly. We've got to build consensus in the industry with the regulators. In some cases, there may be some legislation required, and so there's a lot of heavy lifting here to get done, and we're committed to that. We're going to find the right avenues to get buy-in to these ideas. Some of them probably can get completed more quickly, and some of them are going to take, a little bit longer to get done. But I think they're all worthy priorities for us to be pursuing, and we're confident that we're going to accomplish some of them.
Yeah, and I would say the one thing that the motoring public and we as alliance carriers have in common, and where there's alignment, is we want to make the roadway safer. And the priorities that we've identified here, the reason why we've identified them is we believe, and we believe we can demonstrate that these priorities, if adopted, will make the highway safer. And it gets at really in many cases, some of the root cause issues that cause crashes to happen. So we just believe these are sensible and achievable reforms. And to Greer's point, they may not all be achievable, in the next 12 months, but we believe they're all attainable and meaningful. And so we're going to continue focusing on these priorities.
And with that, we're going to wrap up this great discussion here with trucking industry officials who are also very, very involved as leaders of the Trucking Alliance. Greer Woodruff of JB Hunt, Brett Sant of Knight Transportation, Steve Williams, who's with Maverick, but is also the co-founder and president of the Trucking Alliance, and Lane Kidd, who's the managing director of the Trucking Alliance. I've been your host today, John Kingston. I'm the editor-at-large at FreightWaves. Thanks for joining us, and please keep watching FreightWaves TV.